A mighty battle raged on, with fiery projectiles hurled at a castle. Numerous troops struggled to defend the castle against the approaching hordes. Despite their efforts, parts of the castle crumbled, and people on the walls plunged into the depths. People were torn apart during the battle as well. Orcs climbed up the castle walls and infiltrated the interior. While the people tried to defend themselves, they were steadily pushed back. Nevertheless, their unwavering courage remained unshaken, and they fought tirelessly, determined to defeat every single orc. However, the orcs themselves were unwavering in their fighting spirit and continued to attack without regard for losses. The orc mages blocked the raining fireballs with their magic. A magical dome thwarted all the attacks from the people, perfectly shielding the orcs. But the orcs had another trump card up their sleeves and put themselves into a berserker state. Deputy Commander Filion of the humans recognized their condition and was displeased that the orcs were now in a berserker state. Together with some of his comrades, he stood on a tower on the south side and realized that it was only a matter of time until the south gate fell. He looked down at the orcs and recognized that their overwhelming numbers alone posed a problem. But the real problem would arise if the Orc Lord decided to join the fight as well. The Orc Lord was different from the other orcs because he was also a master of aura. That meant he could use special aura abilities. Meanwhile, the orcs had already taken the walls. It was a terrible massacre. They ran as they pleased and killed all the people who fell into their hands. Although the people did their best to stop them and defend themselves, the orcs simply used them as stepping stones for their massive feat. However, a mysterious turquoise aura rose from the bodies of the people, whether the orcs held them in their hands or they lay on the blood-stained battlefield. Everywhere was the delicate turquoise mist rising from the corpses, gathering into a larger source of energy in the center. More and more people emitted this mist. Yet it seemed that even the people themselves did not know where the mist came from. The warrior corpses, enveloped in the mist, suddenly rose as undead zombies and mindlessly attacked the orcs. And so the battle raged on between the humans and the orcs. The humans realized that there must be a necromancer on their side because the summoned zombies, undead, and skeletons fought alongside them, filling the battlefield to the point where there was hardly a free spot left. In front of the southern city gate, the Orc Lord continued to fight undeterred, overwhelming the humans with the help of his aura. However, a challenger was already floating in front of him. Black and purple magical spheres floated around him, mysteriously flashing. It was the Necromancer with green hair and a braid. Despite his magic, he had muscles and carried a sword. The Necromancer realized that ordinary zombies couldn't win against an aura master. He raised his hand forward and opened portals behind him, from which powerful monsters streamed onto the battlefield. Together with his numerous undead, who had reached a considerable number by now, he marched onto the battlefield. But the Orc Lord only needed to swing his weapon once forcefully to effortlessly defeat and sweep away the smaller undead from the battlefield. His body was completely surrounded by aura and emitted a faint red glow. With his powerful arms, the Orc Lord prepared to strike and brought it down with full force onto the ground. After his attack, the red aura faded, and the Orc Lord noticed something. Behind him stood a powerful skeleton, stronger than its smaller siblings, also preparing for a vertical strike. However, the Orc Lord brushed aside the attack and countered. Subsequently, another strong undead rushed towards him, delivering a mighty blow that prevented the Orc Lord from countering. Seizing the opportunity, the skeleton prepared for another strike. Together with the larger panther undead, they launched a barrage of attacks against the Orc Lord, who skillfully evaded them. But suddenly, the panther saw its chance and dealt a tremendous blow to the Orc Lord, sending him flying backward. However, the Orc Lord withstood the attack and managed to stay on his feet. While his subordinates continued to fight on the battlefield, the Necromancer also fought with his sword before the gates. The humans observed the Necromancer and became aware of how formidable the world was. They could hardly believe that there was a Necromancer who also possessed excellent sword skills. He and his subordinates impressed with their performance on the battlefield. His giant crushed his opponents with brute force. His elf, on the other hand, pierced through the enemies and unleashed dark lightning. Another one of his followers shattered the enemies and subsequently paralyzed them before finishing them off with his axe, absorbing their energy in the process. The remaining surviving humans were astonished as they witnessed the spectacle on the battlefield. They realized that a single man with his abilities turned the battlefield upside down and showed them a path to victory, even if he employed forbidden magic from the Empire. Compared to the Necromancer's creatures, the humans seemed tiny. The Orc Lord said he had never thought that ordinary corpses could corner him like this and grinned. He continued to say that the Necromancer shouldn't think for a moment that he had already won just because he landed a good blow. He looked at the Necromancer and found it great that he had found a strong opponent like him on the battlefield. His eyes turned slightly redder, and he entered his berserker state, while his aura radiated from his body. However, the only thoughts the Necromancer had at that moment were that the Orc Lord had a magnificent body that he could make his own. The Necromancer then divided his sword into smaller pieces and personally charged towards the Orc Lord. The Orc Lord also rushed forward, and both prepared to attack. The Necromancer swung his whip-like sword, but it was held back by the Orc's aura spirit, while the real Orc also struck, landing a direct hit on the Necromancer. As a result, the Necromancer's body dissolved into that turquoise light emanating from the soldiers' corpses. Suddenly, the Orc reflexively turned around, attempting to block the real Necromancer's attack directly. A fierce collision occurred, and the Orc's sword got stuck in a pile of bones, as the Necromancer had created a bone shield just before the Orc's counterattack succeeded. In the face of the Orc, he realized that he had to become much stronger. Bones started enveloping him from below, fortifying his body. He recognized that he needed to grow stronger to ensure his own survival, and his body became increasingly covered by bones. He remembered some faces and focused his gaze on the imminent battle. More and more faces appeared before his inner eyes. He wanted to survive and become stronger for himself and for those who were important to him in this world. To be able to protect them all. The bones solidified, forming a breastplate. While he considered his soldiers important, his armor was complete. With his new armor, he stood face to face with the Orc Lord, and both were highly focused. The Orc Lord shouted at the Necromancer, telling him to entertain him well in their final battle. The Necromancer charged forward. Although he wanted to protect all his friends and comrades, he also wanted to continue living as Andreas Cromwell. He rushed toward the Orc Lord with tremendous speed, astonishing everyone involved, causing their jaws to drop. He pushed the Orc Lord back excellently and became even faster. His sword ignited during the attacks, further increasing his striking power. However, the Orc Lord also knew how to defend himself and prepared to counter with his real body and aura. It was a beautiful and grand academy with blue and golden accents. It was called the Rodlan Academy, the most prestigious and supportive academy of the Empire, where those deemed promising come to learn. However, among the students, there were those who were not acknowledged. There were secret rooms that could only be accessed through special portals. In one of these rooms, Andreas conversed with an elderly man who asked him if there was something in this secret room. In this room, there was a barrel of water, and many corpses hung from the ceiling. Andreas apologized as he did not remember where he had placed the body he had been working on last week. The older man walked through the room, passing numerous tables where other undead lay, undergoing experimentation, and was disappointed with Andreas for not remembering where the body was. In these rooms, Andreas and the older man studied the forbidden black magic of the Necromancers. If caught, they would be executed immediately. That was why they had to do this secretly. Andreas picked up a large bottle full of blood and carefully poured it on the floor, using it to trace a magical circle around a corpse on the ground. The older man told him to take a step back as he would now begin the ritual. He held a small skull in one hand and placed his other hand above the blood-smeared magic circle. Subsequently, they both enveloped themselves in a turquoise mist. Andreas also surrounded himself with the turquoise mist, which had now spread throughout half of the room. The corpse within the circle rose but let out a scream, indicating that it was another failure. The older man then said that it was enough for today, and while making notes of the experiment, suggested they clear their heads. On the other hand, Andreas thought that he hadn't learned anything new and was disappointed with today's lesson. A torch illuminated the wall, brightening the room. A mop scrubbed the floor, removing the blood that had been used for the magic circle. Andreas cleaned the floor and was still disappointed. He thought that what he was doing here was very dangerous and that despite the high risk, he hadn't learned anything. He looked at a few books on a shelf and contemplated that even though he was so disappointed, he couldn't simply quit. He took one of the books and said that this was the only place where he could read books about dark magic in peace. He apologized once again to the older man for taking so long to clean up. The older man asked Andreas how he would ever manage everything on his own if he already needed half a day to clean up. Andreas found his teacher's statement foolish and thought to himself that he was only slow because he hadn't been taught anything and had to learn everything on his own. But the older man kept nagging and continued to harass Andreas. He told him that even with a simple job, he would get terribly nervous. With a stern gaze, he looked at Andreas and declared that he wouldn't tolerate any more mistakes from him. Andreas replied that he would do his best to satisfy his master. The teacher continued the conversation and mentioned that he didn't know if he could rely on him, but he would give him another chance. He ordered him to go to the Binhales National Graveyard and get him another body. He also reminded Andreas that he was the one who had taken him in as an orphan. For this reason, the teacher believed that he always had to prove to him, anywhere and anytime, that he was worth living. If he failed to do so, he knew exactly what would happen. Emotionlessly, Andreas looked at his teacher and knew that he would then become one of his experiments. The teacher then ordered him to go and not waste any more time. Immediately, Andreas set off. As he opened a door to the corridor, he encountered other students, and he realized that his teacher hadn't even given him the money for the trip to the graveyard. He looked at the other students, and they also saw Andreas, surprised that he was still at this school. He quickly pushed through the students and told them that he wasn't just some object to be stared at. Andreas wasn't thrilled with the current situation. But he also didn't know how to escape from it. He was in the third year of the magic department at the academy, but unlike his classmates, he was a talentless heap of garbage. As an orphan from a fallen family, he tried to gain the favor of the strong and defeat the weak. He was the worst kind in the academy, a villain as a third-year student that no one wanted to associate with. But even though he didn't really want to, he had to continue living as Andreas Cromwell. In reality, he was Makoto Kaneshiro, and he found himself in the world of great sin. Originally, he was a member of the special forces who couldn't accept life as a regular citizen. The only thing that provided him solace in the normal world was great sin. A video game. He immersed himself so deeply in the game that he forgot everything around him. After finally completing the game after 12 weeks, he received a call from a mysterious voice that knew his real name and possessed detailed information about him and his gaming habits. He quickly shut down his computer. But without realizing it, he became a character in his own game, 6 months before the actual main story begins. He became Andreas, a character who is always pursued by the shadow of death. Andreas further explained that all the characters in the game had to participate in the same event. They would discover the identity of his teacher, Sharon, and kill him together with Andreas. This made Andreas realize that he needed to find a way to distance himself from Sharon before the main story began. The thought of not being able to escape the characters haunted Andreas. As he looked at the academy, he wondered if he could really make it. Sitting on a bench, Andreas realized that he had no choice but to become stronger before the scenario began. The only thing he could rely on were the special character traits he had acquired while playing. Determined, he stood up and set off on his journey. In doing so, he thought about one of the traits that had been random, and he had received the dual core trait. This allowed him to learn and perfect both magic and sword fighting. He realized that he already had problems and doubted that he could survive if he focused only on one of the two abilities. Learning both in such a short time seemed nearly impossible. He continued on his way, contemplating that he had to rely on the other character trait he had chosen for now. He looked at his hand, adorned with a ring, and realized he had no other choice. He had to choose a trait that best harmonized with his necromancy. Determinedly, he clenched his fist and prepared to select a character trait. In front of him appeared a red system window. For the first time, Andreas looked at the selection of character traits and was astonished by the many possibilities open to him. At first glance, he saw some traits that didn't harmonize with his necromancy at all. Thoughtfully stroking his chin, he considered which trait he should choose. He wanted to focus on one he had never seen before. He was certain that among all the traits, there had to be a good one for him. Amidst the search among all the possible options, he caught sight of the evolution trait. Surprised, he pondered the potential possibilities. Evolution described a phenomenon in which living organisms could reach a higher level. Andreas had never seen this trait before, and it seemed to offer exactly what he needed most urgently now. He desperately wanted to find something that would allow him to grow quickly and leave the others behind. He didn't want to think any longer about what if and ultimately chose this trait. Andreas had made his decision and looked down at the city at the foot of the academy. The system window confirmed his selection before disappearing. Now he saw the possibilities that this character trait could bring him. He looked at himself, his panther, and the skeleton zombie, his fairy and titan, as well as a gigantic skeleton dragon. In that moment, he made up his mind to conquer this world as Andreas. The story of Andreas continued in the Maple Leaf dormitory of the Golden Academy, which could be used by the students free of charge. It was an old, beautiful building that may not have looked as luxurious as the academy itself, but was still well maintained. Andreas was a very minor villain in the actual game, and now that one was stuck in his body, they realized how weak he truly was. Sitting on his bed, he looked outside, contemplating how he could barely manage basic elemental magic. Therefore, his abilities as a necromancer are the only thing he could rely on. That's why he had chosen the evolution trait to further support and expand his necromancy. Andreas stood up, grabbed his cloak, and decided to make a quick detour to the underground laboratory before continuing his mission and going to the cemetery to fetch a new body for his teacher. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. He was determined to become stronger as quickly as possible, not just for the next event, but also to be better prepared, as there were many characters who could kill him besides his master. He walked through the door leading to the underground laboratory and glanced at some books with unusual titles. These books were meant to teach him dark necromancy. Andreas knew that if he were to be discovered with just one of these books, it would mean instant death. However, he also knew that something else could mean his immediate demise. And he looked back into the lab where a person was caged. It was a semi-naked woman with red-orange hair, bound to the wall inside the cage. Andreas knew she was a vampire. Vampires in this world were unaffected by sunlight and could also wield very powerful magic. They were not a species that Sharon could easily obtain. Andreas thought about how she was roughly on the level of a mid-game boss. Suddenly, the vampire spoke to him, causing Andreas to turn around. The vampire asked if he wouldn't help her escape. A train swiftly passed over a bridge, and due to the speed of the ride, the city in the background was only fleetingly visible. Andreas sat on this train, contemplating the conversation with the vampire, which seemed very enticing to him. He believed it to be a heaven-sent gift, a stroke of luck in his favor. The vampire promised that if Andreas were to set her free, she would kill Sharon for him. She also asked if he wasn't afraid that Sharon would eventually kill him first. Andreas hadn't expected anything less and knew that the vampire had read his thoughts when he was focused on the books. In that moment, he had been so careless and hadn't acted like Andreas. The vampire appeared quite serious in this situation because she knew it was her only chance to escape and make Sharon pay for imprisoning her. Andreas told her that if he were to set her free, there would be no guarantee that she wouldn't harm him as well. In response, she swore not to kill him. She repeated this a few times, but had a sly grin on her face. Andreas wondered if a high-ranking being like a vampire would keep promises made to mere mortals. He looked down at her incredulously, questioning whether he should really believe her. Additionally, Andreas pondered if it was too soon to betray his teacher directly and whether it could cause further problems in the current timeline. The vampire, on the other hand, told him that there was no time to consider the matter but urged him to set her free now. However, Andreas wanted to conduct further research to learn more about vampires. He knew that there was a book about them somewhere. The train continued its journey and had now reached a tunnel, which it passed through. Meanwhile, the next stop was announced, the National Cemetery, with Hearthfell Station as the stop. Gasping for breath, Andreas dragged a suitcase behind him as he walked the final stretch to the cemetery. Completely out of breath, he realized that everything would be easier if he had money, but for now, he had to rely on good old physical strength and hard work. He looked at the entrance gate to the cemetery and knew that this was where all the black mages obtained their corpses. Andreas spoke to the guard who was watching the gate, claiming that he came from Jenny's house and was the third grandson. The guard asked if he had brought flowers. Andreas confirmed this and said that he had brought 13 azure sky irises, successfully gaining access to the cemetery. Luckily, he remembered the password from his previous game time. He continued dragging the suitcase and encountered an older man who was taking a short break from digging up a corpse. He recognized Andreas and told him that he had perfect timing and had come at the right moment. He showed Andreas the corpse he had just unearthed, which was the corpse of a knight, as previously agreed upon with Sharon. The knight held a golden sword in its arms. The man told Andreas to take it or leave if he wasn't satisfied. Andreas was somewhat overwhelmed by the situation but thanked the man and took the corpse. With his weak body, he tried to carry it into his suitcase. Having barely managed, he was ready to head back before it was too late. But as he sat panting and exhausted over his suitcase, he noticed a grave adorned with a beautiful tombstone. Several candles stood on it, and flowers were placed as well. Andreas felt as though he had seen the name on the tombstone before and suddenly recognized it. He also remembered where he had seen it. It was the name Nicol Lifehill, and this man was an aura master. Nicol was someone who had spent years training in complete isolation to follow the path of the sword. He trained until his hair and beard turned gray, becoming a badass anime grandpa in the process. He swung his sword from top to bottom repeatedly until he was eventually able to slice through the air. However, even though he chose the path of the sword and became an aura master, he died once he achieved his goal due to his old age. Originally, this was a small Easter egg. Andreas wondered why they had introduced something like that because no one knew that he had ultimately succeeded in achieving his dream and becoming an aura master. In the meantime, the old man working in the cemetery had already started filling in the grave. Andreas continued to think about Nicol and wondered what would happen if he managed to create a dark knight from Nicol's body. Of course, he knew that even Sharon couldn't create a first-class dark knight in the present time. However, once Andreas further developed his character through evolution, it would no longer be a problem for him. So he wanted to start looking for a suitable body now, someone with the talent to become his subordinate. He approached the gravekeeper, who had just finished filling in the grave. The gravekeeper went on the offensive and asked Andreas if he wanted a different body. However, if that were the case, he would need Karen's permission first because he didn't have the right to arrange such a thing on his own. Andreas thought for a moment and asked if the gravekeeper would make an exception if he exchanged the body for his signet ring. Surprised and fascinated by the ring, the gravekeeper looked at it. He recognized that it was the seal of a count and realized that he could fetch a lot of money by selling it. He questioned whether he was truly willing to trade it for a body. Andreas told him that he had nothing else but this old ring and that he would gladly give it away since, as a mage, only the results of his experiments mattered to him. The gravekeeper, who had already made up his mind and was acting a bit, hesitated. However, when Andreas handed him the ring and assured him that he wouldn't tell Sharon about it, he was certain that the gravekeeper would give in, which he did, telling Andreas that he could have another body. Andreas knew that the ring was valuable, but the body meant more to him than any amount of gold. He thanked the gravekeeper and instructed him which grave to dig up. The moon shone particularly beautifully that night, casting a soft blue light upon the earth. When the gravekeeper finished, Andreas opened the coffin and examined Nickel's corpse. He was glad that the clear future he had seen yesterday through his character selection was slowly coming closer, and he was taking the first steps in that direction. Once he returned, he intended to begin his necromancer training immediately. With the images of his first subordinate in the background, Andreas still couldn't quite believe that he would soon become stronger. He definitely wanted to rely on his first subordinate. When Andreas returned to the laboratory, he had to start working right away. He placed the body he had to retrieve for Sharon on a table and realized that it was an ordinary, usable body. He had to take care of this body, prepare it. Moreover, he was responsible for it and would be punished if anything happened to it. Around him were more experiments and individual body parts, as well as tools. Andreas wasn't very pleased that he was being ordered around immediately upon his return. But he also knew that he worked better when annoyed, and he thought that his body would instinctively remember the work. He wore a leather mask and wiped the sweat from his forehead with one hand. He wanted to quickly finish the tedious work for Sharon and finally be able to start his studies. After preparing the corpse, he wiped away some blood while corpses still hung from the ceiling above him. He thought about Nickel in his suitcase and wondered if he would be able to use him at his level. He knew that at his level, he could only work with a skeleton. Andreas pondered whether his character trait would also affect his subordinates but was uncertain since he had never used this trait before. Additionally, he didn't have any money left to test it on another body beforehand. Suddenly, the chains clanged as they tensed. The vampire addressed Andreas once again, asking how long he intended to keep them waiting. Andreas looked back at the cage and replied that they weren't asleep as he had thought. The vampire emphasized that they had already sworn not to harm him and asked again if he wouldn't free them and if he wanted to toil for Sharon for the rest of his life. Andreas approached the cage, standing directly in front of her. He had been waiting for this conversation. With a hopeful look, the vampire asked if he was finally sane and would finally set them free. Andreas had always wondered how Sharon managed to capture and imprison such a vampire. But as he read the book, which he had to think about on the train, which was about vampires, he found the answer. The vampire wondered why he had been staring at her silently the whole time and asked why he was doing that. She also asked if he still had doubts. She told him to hurry up and make a decision, otherwise, she would kill him herself, even if he freed her. Andreas said that he would free her, to which she widened her eyes. He explained that he could no longer work for Sharon. Joyfully, she held out her handcuffs to him and asked if he would truly free her now. Andreas said that he would, but she would have to swear on the name of her family that she wouldn't harm him. Upon hearing this, she widened her eyes, and her body language changed. Andreas recognized from her reaction that the things described in the book were indeed true. He had read that a vampire who swore on the name of their family could not break that oath. Suddenly, Andreas also widened his eyes when the vampire agreed to his condition. She swore on the name of Lucifer. Andreas was surprised at how easily it went. When the vampire swore on the name of her family, a system window opened in front of Andreas, informing him that he had fulfilled certain conditions and that the system had found a species capable of evolving. The probability of the vampire Angela becoming Angela Lucifer was currently 55%. To Angela's surprise, Andreas fiddled with something in the system windows. Andreas wondered why he had the ability to evolve others as well, depending on whether they were his subordinates or not. The system window described the type of development and that the goal could be developed to a higher level. Furthermore, it directly asked him if he wanted to develop her or not. Andreas thought about taking the opportunity before using it on Nickel to see the effects of evolution. He also thought that even if something were to happen, he wouldn't be at fault. Angela asked him what he was waiting for and if he had deceived her and didn't actually want to set her free. In the system, he selected yes and decided to evolve Angela. She was completely shocked, and a stabbing pain ran through her body. She screamed in pain, holding her head and falling to the ground. Andreas looked on in astonishment at the spectacle unfolding before him. Angela could hardly bear the pain and gasped in agony. When she regained some semblance of consciousness, she asked Andreas what he had done. Another wave of pain filled her body, and she fainted back onto the floor. Andreas wondered what was happening as she lay unconscious down there. He said she should pull herself together because otherwise, he wouldn't know if the evolution was a success or a failure. Nevertheless, whether it had worked or not, he had learned something new about his character trait. If he could evolve beings that weren't his own subordinates, he could certainly evolve his own subordinates as well. He prepared Nickel on a table and intended to make him one of his subordinates. He smeared some blood on the ground again and drew a magic circle in the center, placing Nickel's body inside. Andreas prepared to summon him. He raised his hands to chest height above him and gathered the turquoise mist again, while staring at the skeleton summoning. Then a system window appeared, informing him that a corpse had been found that was also capable of practicing necromancy. Additionally, the system added another effect to the corpse. Andreas was completely surprised by the message and couldn't believe what he had read. In addition to the turquoise mist, a black, dark mist now appeared, swirling around the corpse. Nickel floated slightly above the ground. While Andreas continued to perform the ceremony, he realized that it took an immense amount of mana to summon a simple skeleton. Slowly, the skin detached from the bones of the corpse until only the bones remained visible. As the last bit of skin dissolved into thin air, the skeleton, completely enveloped in the turquoise mist, stood upright. Andreas, lying exhausted on the ground, watched in astonishment. The system informed him that the skeleton summoning was a success and that he had summoned a legendary-level skeleton. Additionally, it notified him that his skeleton summoning spell had reached level 3. Andreas couldn't believe that it had worked. Furthermore, the system informed him that the skeleton had a very high level, granting him a series of advantages such as rank promotion and reclassification as a skeleton soldier. Moreover, it could recall certain things from its previous life. He looked at the skeleton and saw his status window next to it. Based on the status window and the sword mastery attribute, Andreas realized that Nickel had indeed been an aura master in his previous life. Subsequently, the skeleton communicated using sign language. Andreas explained to it that he was now its master and that he would take care of it and be responsible for it. The skeleton understood this, and Andreas felt confident about their future together. Once he returned to his room, he relaxed a bit. He looked at his calendar and knew that it would still take a year for Sharon to die. However, he also knew that there were still several things to be done by then. He opened the system window and checked his status. But first, Andreas wanted to summon his skeleton, so he got up and asked his system to summon the skeleton he had stored in another dimension for so long. It came through a blue portal to Andreas in his dimension. Andreas knew it would be bad if someone found his new friend, so he decided to give him some clothes first. It was a sunny day outside, and it was peaceful. The skeleton wore a black parka with a hood and a red scarf. Andreas thought it now looked like a real human, no matter how you looked at it. Suddenly, the skeleton began training with an imaginary sword. Andreas realized that the Easter egg description had not been a lie. He remembered the description that said Nickel had actually died during training and wanted to continue training even after his death. Then he smiled because it wasn't a bad thing for him. He clenched his fist and had finally found a way to train his character trait. Andreas called out Nickel's name, causing him to pause his training. He asked if Andreas could teach him the art of swordsmanship. Nickel immediately began teaching his new master the art of swordsmanship. He showed him the basics and corrected his posture. However, Andreas was so strained just from maintaining the posture that he was dripping with sweat and his body trembled from the effort. He was grateful that God had taught him to endure such physical strain. Additionally, he found it crazy that his first mentor was a master of aura and trained him so rigorously. Nevertheless, he knew that with proper training, he too could use aura in the future. Furthermore, he could switch between mana and aura since he possessed the dual core attribute. He would embark on the path of a magical sword master, utilizing not only mana in his heart but also in his dantian. Unfortunately, it would be a bit more challenging to grow initially, but once he mastered the initial phase, he would be stronger than anyone else. Just like the first king, Edmund, who founded the kingdom. Nickel would pinch Andreas every time he deviated from the prescribed form as a punishment, causing Andreas to scream like a little girl. Andreas asked him what that was about, to which Nickel used sign language to make it clear that he should focus and not get lost in his thoughts. Andreas also asked how Nickel's grip could be so strong, even though it consisted only of a few bones. Nickel attempted to explain, but all that could be heard was the clattering of his teeth. Andreas remembered that he was a member of the Special Forces before entering the game. So he didn't really find the physical training to be that bad. He wanted to show the original Andreas a thing or two about guts. However, the screams he let out when Nickel pinched him again could be heard throughout the entire community building. In the evening, Andreas sat at his desk with a cup of tea and a small tea kettle, wondering how developed his necromancy skill was since he had skipped class today to train with Nickel. He opened his status window and found that in the 5 hours that Nickel had been in his dimension and trained with him, he had gained 2 points. It was faster than he thought. Of course, he knew that it would take much longer to level up the beginner level of his abilities. Additionally, he found it strange that his teacher, Sharon, hadn't called him in a while. The vampire woman, who was still unconscious in her cage, still appeared normal, so Sharon hadn't discovered that Andreas had further developed her. Andreas realized that it would take a very long time for the development to be complete and worried that something might go wrong. He looked somewhat annoyed in his room. Nickel was still training diligently there. He wiped off his sweat again and told Nickel that while he knew he had unlimited endurance and didn't feel fatigue, he was overdoing it with his training. He also thought that if he had a potion to help regenerate his endurance, he could train just as much. There were 2 potions that would be useful to him at the moment. One was the healing potion, which heals internal injuries and alleviates fatigue, and the other was the regeneration potion, which heals external wounds and significantly improves the regeneration rate. Unfortunately, there was no way for someone as poor as him to afford these potions. Andreas considered whether he should make the potions himself to keep the costs lower. However, he also knew that the manufacturing process would not be as simple as in the game. Although he knew all the necessary ingredients, he lacked the precise proportions. Determined, he stood up and decided to attend a lecture on potions to expand his knowledge. He made his way to the main building of the academy and opened the door to the lecture hall. Several students were already there, waiting for the teacher. As Andreas entered the classroom, the whispering of the other students about him began. They wondered why he had come to the potions class. Their first assumption was that he had only come to pick up a few girls. As they continued gossiping, Andreas could hear everything. However, he decided to ignore it and endure. He looked around the class and spotted a girl with short, blondish white hair. She sighed and seemed equally bored with the gossip. Finally, the teacher entered the room and began the class. Professor Vauban taught intermediate herbology at the academy. He stood at the front of the class, speaking about individual ingredients for potions. Andreas listened to the lecture half-heartedly since he already knew the content from the game. What interested him were the precise measurements for the potions. Bored, he continued to listen and wondered when the teacher would get to the point that interested him. Finally, the time came. The teacher explained that his next topic was a method for brewing a physical reinforcement potion. He repeated himself and explained to the students that the base of this potion was mohin leaves, mixed with 3 other ingredients. As the teacher continued speaking and pointing at the board with his stick, Andreas was confused. He didn't know this recipe, and the explanation didn't align with his game experience. He was also surprised that the teacher presented a recipe with so many side effects. In response, he raised his hand and asked the teacher if he could ask a question. The teacher allowed it. Andreas asked why he didn't add 2 more ingredients. This question puzzled the teacher and piqued the interest of the girl who had sighed earlier. The whole class fell silent, and all eyes turned to Andreas. The teacher adjusted his glasses and asked why he should do that. He added that if he were to do that, he wouldn't be brewing a potion but rather making a soup. The whole class burst into laughter. Andreas was puzzled because the ingredients he listed were the ones needed for a physical reinforcement potion. He was surprised by this reaction from the teacher. While the others laughed, he continued to ponder and concluded that the method he knew to brew a potion with fewer or no side effects had not been discovered yet. After the class ended and he left the room, he thought that his knowledge was much better than what he had learned in that class. He contemplated whether it would be better to learn on his own and found his idea of attending the class not so wise. He slung his bag over his shoulder and headed to the research department. However, the blondish white-haired girl watched him with interest as he left. When Andreas arrived in the research area, he sat at a table with many scientific devices and liquids. His notes lay in front of him, and there was a large shelf with many books on the wall. He was currently trying to figure out the mixing ratio of the potion he knew from his game time, but the system kept reporting that the potion making failed. Frustrated, he was annoyed by yet another failure and visibly disappointed. He leaned back and contemplated that even if he knew the recipe, he would need a reliable method to prepare it. He also worried about the cost of the materials, which were much higher than he had anticipated. If he continued to use them for failures, he would soon go bankrupt. Andreas wondered what would happen if someone were to help him, but he concluded that it was impossible for someone to be willing to help someone like him. Suddenly, the door to his room opened a crack, and a small light shone through. The blondish white-haired girl from his class stuck her head through the door. She approached Andreas and said that she had been expecting him to be there. Andreas was shocked because he knew that she was one of the playable characters in the game, and he wondered what she was doing here. She was Lucia Everlast, one of the characters that players could choose to play the game with. Her special talent lay in potion making. Furthermore, Andreas was surprised why she was here. Normally, she shouldn't have any close contact with him. Lucia wiped away the charred smoke that lingered in the air due to the failure and reminded him of his setback. Andreas wanted to ignore her and hoped that she would disappear. But she leaned forward slightly and asked him what he was experimenting with. He replied that it was a secret. Andreas was somewhat annoyed. Not only had he attended the class, which had brought him nothing, but now he had even more problems than before due to his presence there. He tried to ignore her and turned back to his experiments, at which point Lucia looked somewhat irritated. However, she didn't give up, sighed, and said that he was really bitter. Andreas had only one thought: she should just disappear. Lucia said that she hadn't expected Andreas to make the first move, causing him to turn around curiously. She placed her hand next to him and leaned slightly over his table. Then she asked him if he wouldn't like to study together with her. Confidently, she continued to ask if he didn't think it would be a good idea to learn together. Andreas felt that there was no reason to reject this request. So, he asked her what she wanted and what she hoped to achieve from their collaboration. Lucia replied that it was so unusual for her to seek someone to research and learn together. Andreas responded that she would have no benefits from their collaboration. Lucia retorted that she would be very grateful if they could work together. She also explained that she had realized that Andreas had talent and was on the verge of creating something great. She looked forward to developing medicine that didn't exist in their world yet. Andreas silently contemplated. Actually, he wanted to make potions for himself. He knew that Lucia's interest in potions didn't stem from having a certain talent for it but rather from the fact that she needed to find a way to cure her illness, which could potentially be fatal. Even the most renowned doctors and pharmacists couldn't cure her illness, so she began teaching herself potion making. The disease she had was given to her by the system itself. Andreas also knew that no one else besides him was capable of finding an antidote for her, as he had played the game so intensively. However, he couldn't risk someone as intelligent as her discovering his true identity, as she would immediately kill him. He realized that she suddenly had an interest in him because of the things he had said in class. Andreas continued to ignore her, thinking that he shouldn't anger her recklessly. Therefore, he told her that he wasn't interested in collaboration and asked her to please leave. In response, Lucia mentioned the name of a mushroom. This surprised Andreas, and he made a shocked expression. She explained to him that he hadn't mentioned this mushroom in class. But it was another essential ingredient for the potion he wanted to brew. Andreas was surprised that she knew about the main ingredient. Normally, no one besides him should know about this ingredient. Lucia pointed to a test tube and told him that if he added this mushroom, he would be able to make a potion. Proudly, she said that she knew this intuitively and that despite his rejection, she was willing to help him. She also mentioned that they could even earn some money if they were successful. However, Andreas declined again and told her to please leave if she had finished what she came for. He didn't want to risk giving up his life so easily just because of her attractive offer. Lucia then started to leave, but before she exited the room, she told Andreas that she would give him some more time to reconsider her offer. She believed that he would change his mind soon. Andreas watched her annoyed and knew that it wouldn't happen so soon. Because even though he wouldn't have to worry about normal collaboration, he found the risk of being exposed too high. After conducting enough research for the time being, he made his way back to his room to continue training there. He trained alongside Nickel and contemplated that he still couldn't solve the problem of the correct mixing ratios on his own. Additionally, he thought during training that another problem was money. And he needed to come up with a way to obtain something to afford the ingredients. He considered whether a good idea would come to him for this problem. Suddenly, he startled as Nickel trained with full concentration and executed a downward strike. Andreas knew that Nickel had purposely exaggerated this strike to remind him that a certain focus was necessary during training. So, he decided to concentrate more during training and think about his money problems later. He thought about an envelope on his desk and whether there really was no way to earn money. The only idea he had was to ask his older sister for money, from whom the letter came stating that she missed him. However, he realized that this was exactly what the previous Andreas had done. Nevertheless, he didn't know how else to help himself, and even though he didn't approve of this way of getting money, he couldn't find any other option. However, he told himself that this would be the last time he would do it. As Andreas walked across the academy campus, he happened to be recognized by another girl. She was surprised to see him carrying a book and wondered if he had changed and finally made something of himself. However, she concluded that even if he had changed and was finally learning something, it would be impossible for his trashy personality to have changed. And so, she wanted to forget that she had seen him. The girl who thought of him this way was Diane Alvin, the magical prodigy and the youngest girl of the Alvin family. Another character who was normally playable and could easily kill Andreas if she found out he was using dark magic. When Andreas and Diane were younger, they had a very good relationship and often played together. However, after Andreas' family could no longer repay their debts, their good relationship fell apart. He also remembered that the original Andreas had done some unpleasant things back then, which would probably already be enough for her to kill him in a normal conversation. He thought about it, realizing that it wouldn't be unusual for her to kill him, and he recognized that he had already encountered many people who could kill him. However, amidst all his thoughts, he realized that asking his sister for money was truly the only option to quickly become stronger and reduce the danger of being killed, which was currently looming over him. Andreas set off for the capital city of Rodlen. Once he arrived in the city, he knew that the place he was looking for must be somewhere ahead of him. It was a large, fancy house, and the lights from the street, shining in the night, sparkled on the building. Andreas and his sister sat in a small room upstairs, equipped with a window through which they could see the other guests visiting the building. His sister asked him why he hadn't responded to the many letters she had sent him and if something had happened. Andreas apologized to his sister, Amy, for making her work despite being a lady of the count. However, she told him that he didn't need to apologize as he bore no guilt. Full of shame and nervousness, Andreas clutched a small cup. Amy asked him why he had such a peculiar expression and began to giggle. She also asked him if he needed money again. She immediately handed him an envelope, explaining that she had suspected as much and had already prepared some money. He accepted the envelope, and Amy added that he shouldn't spend the money irresponsibly. Andreas thanked her and assured her that he would repay the money. Suddenly, his sister's eyes widened, and she asked Andreas where his ring was. Which shocked Andreas as well. He lied to his sister, saying that he had taken it off to avoid losing it. Curiously, Amy inquired if he would really take good care of the ring. Andreas couldn't tell her the truth. But Amy asked him, already suspecting that he had given it away, if he had actually done so. She trembled all over and couldn't believe that he had done this particular thing. Andreas knew he couldn't lie because no matter what he would say, she would recognize that he was lying. She pounded her hands on the table and looked at the dejected Andreas. In anger, she said that he wanted to disappear and that she didn't want to see him anymore. She stormed out of the room and also said that he should never come back and that he didn't need to repay the money either. Andreas jumped up and yelled for her to wait. He would get it back. But his sister ran out of the room and slammed the door behind her. He realized that this ring was truly important to his sister and that he had never seen her like this before. Amy was still running and crying, tears streaming down her cheeks, while Andreas stood rooted to the spot, wondering about the terrible feeling he was experiencing. He looked down at his hand and wanted to retrieve the ring as soon as possible. He remembered the death of his comrades and questioned the meaning of life when one only survives. He himself wasn't very happy when he became the sole survivor of his unit back then. He was determined to follow through with what he now had and achieve success. That's why he wanted to accept Lucia's offer, swallow his pride, and take the risk. A week had passed since Andreas made the decision to accept Lucia's offer. Throughout that entire week, he spent his time refining and perfecting his potion. Lucia eventually urged him to leave his room and engage in some training. So he started running and spent all his time working on the potion and training with her, which was naturally exhausting. Meanwhile, Lucia mostly lounged around lazily. However, when she decided to get up and help, she was a great support and things progressed much faster. Most of the time, though, she lay on the couch and slept. Andreas called her name, to which she sleepily responded. He asked her why it felt like he was the only one working. She retorted that he was just imagining it. Over time, this made him somewhat angry. Yet, even in her half-asleep state, Lucia could give instructions to Andreas and share her expertise. She told him that he needed to change the ratio of ingredients, using a bit less of one thing and a bit more of another. Andreas knew she was right and always followed her instructions despite her laziness. Her intuition was truly accurate, always pinpointing the problem he had. Thanks to her help, he could usually solve it immediately. As he continued to experiment and mix ingredients, he reflected on their collaboration. Although he worked with her for financial reasons, he found it to be the best decision he could have made. He added some more liquid to his potion and then took a small sample using a pipette. He dropped a drop of the sample into a test tube, and the liquid inside changed. Andreas was somewhat shocked when suddenly the system window informed him that he had successfully brewed a physical reinforcement potion at the intermediate level. Laughing loudly, he could hardly believe his luck and jumped up to wake Lucia, who was sleeping again. She asked if he had failed again and that's why he was so loud. Somewhat incredulous about his success, he looked over at Lucia on the couch and told her that he had done it and successfully created the potion. With that, he temporarily ended his potion experiments. Additionally, the system window showed him that he had unlocked a talent and was able to develop it based on his character traits. He realized that he could probably develop anything as long as he fulfilled the conditions. When Andreas read that he had only reached 32%, he thought of Angela, the vampire. So he dismissed the window and decided to let it be for now. Lucia was also thrilled with the finished potion and surprised that it had no side effects and could be taken every day. She wanted to inform the potion examination committee immediately about this potion. Andreas told her that she could handle that part since he had taken care of all the experimentation. Lucia replied that although she had a lot to do with the midterm exams tomorrow, she wanted to take care of submitting it to the committee since he had done most of the work up until now. And so, another day came to an end with a beautiful sunset. In the secret chambers of the dark magician and Andreas's teacher, Angela lay motionless on the floor, still needing to wait for 14 days, 21 hours, and 33 minutes until her development was complete. In her thoughts, she repeatedly called out Andreas's name, wondering what he had done to her and why her whole body was filled with a burning sensation and pain. However, she knew that there had to be something behind these pains. Shortly after their success with the potion, the midterm exams began, and they took a train to their examination site. Shortly before reaching their final stop, they were supposed to meet on the train to explain to the students what lay ahead for them. Andreas read a book on the train and thought that he shouldn't worry about Lucia because her talent would easily help her pass the midterm exams. After the midterm exams were over, their next step was the Magician Tower to complete the final step of their potion, presenting it to the committee for evaluation. Andreas had also prepared well for the midterm exams and trained his swordsmanship with nickel. He set aside his book and reassured himself that everything would be fine for now if he passed the exams. He also thought about Angela's development, which should be completed soon, and that he should check on her afterwards. Andreas believed that upon his return, he would apologize to Angela and explain that he had developed her, hoping she would understand her situation. However, as he continued to focus on his book and contemplate all the upcoming events, two students were having a conversation on the train. One of them was the genius Diane Alvin, who was asked by her friend what she thought the midterm exams would be about this year. Her friend told her that the task and the groups they would be assigned to were random and that it would be a piece of cake for her to pass the exams if she was lucky. However, Diane explained to her friend that she didn't care who she ended up in a group with, she would do her best and pass regardless. But her friend whispered to her that it might not be so easy after all and discreetly looked over at Andreas. In response, Andreas put away his book, and one could see the differences between his initial and current appearance, which astonished Diane and made her gulp nervously. Suddenly, an announcement was made that the students should prepare to disembark at their Auckland training station in a minute. The group's teacher instructed all the students to stand up and leave the train. As a large building appeared in the background, the teacher explained that, as previously known, this year's midterm exams would be a group work where the members of each group would be randomly selected. He further explained that each group would consist of 3 students from the warrior class and 1 student from the magician class. Additionally, each group would have a supervisor. The teacher stated that each group had until next Monday to complete the assigned task. After his explanation, he wished all the participants good luck and announced the groups. Andreas wasn't thrilled with his group. Besides him and Sharon, his teacher, there were a few other villains at the school. And it so happened that 2 of them were in his group for the exam. The first one was Hazar Gapri, a brown-haired young man who fought for a cult. The other was a green-haired young woman known as a random murderer, Vivian Belcan. In addition to them, his group also included the supervisor Ivy Clare and Christopher Granny. As Andreas looked at the paper with the members of his group, he realized that he hadn't been so lucky after all. Suddenly, someone called his name, and he turned around. It was Christopher, who introduced himself and told Andreas that they were in the same group. Andreas immediately noticed that despite being a magician, Christopher trained like a warrior, which he found repulsive and irritating. So he told Andreas that their paths should never cross. Andreas wondered why Christopher approached him so aggressively from the beginning. Then Hazar also arrived and introduced himself. Hazar also found someone as unfriendly as Christopher, a warrior, to be a problem. Vivian introduced herself to the group shortly after but wasn't a woman of many words. Christopher confronted Hazar about his earlier statement, intending to start an argument. As the two argued, Andreas couldn't believe the kind of group he had ended up with. Additionally, he had another problem apart from his three teammates. Andreas looked back and saw his supervisor, Ivy, who seemed to have a slight cigarette addiction and was wearing an outrageously short leather thong. Ivy had short yellow hair and didn't appear very friendly. Andreas believed he had encountered the worst possible group he could have. The teacher stated that once a group had formed, they could immediately begin their task and bid them farewell, hoping they would all return alive. Andreas looked at the grim faces of his group and wondered how he would come back alive with such a group. Finding the task itself very challenging, the group boarded a train and headed to their assigned location. On the train, their supervisor, Ivy Clare, introduced herself. She held up a piece of paper and asked everyone to take a look at it. The paper contained their task, which involved investigating a village in the territory of Baron Boleric. There were rumors that the landlord had been killed, and a few investigators had already been sent there but had unfortunately disappeared. After everyone had read the task, Ivy asked if there were any problems or if everyone understood the assignment. Andreas was truly surprised by her aggression and didn't remember her being that aggressive. Apart from the fact that she would soon become the youngest Aura Master, he didn't have much information about her. He knew from the game that her abilities would undoubtedly be remarkable, but he was concerned that her personality could make things a bit more difficult. She was already mocking him on the train, calling him seagrass due to his hair, and asking if a mage like him could even lift weights. Andreas immediately retorted, saying he didn't want to hear that from someone who needed beef jerky to appear cool. Ivy replied that she couldn't smoke on the train and had to eat something all the time, jokingly suggesting that she could chew on him instead of beef jerky. Hazar tried to calm down their arguments and mentioned that they would soon arrive at their destination. They headed towards a castle situated on a mountain. Down in the valley of the mountain lay a small village. Our group entered the castle and was amazed by the grand estate owned by Baron Boleric. Baron Boleric was an older man with a beard. He warmly welcomed our group and explained that what had happened was a true tragedy. He was eager to explain the situation to the group. As the sun set outside, he informed them that the landlord of Thrym village was his nephew. Although he was also a baron, he had no family. He provided them with all the information he had. Ivy thanked him for sharing all the details with them. Baron Boleric's butler approached him and whispered something in his ear, which concerned the baron's son. Andreas overheard the conversation to some extent and looked at them skeptically. He immediately sensed that something wasn't quite right. After this conversation, the Baron pondered for a moment and then stood up. He said he had something to attend to and wished the group good luck with their mission. The butler apologized to the group for the Baron's sudden departure, explaining that his son was feeling unwell and he had to check on him. Ivy said it was all right and they had received everything they needed. Besides, they were planning to leave any moment and continue their journey to the village. At that moment, the butler's expression changed, which Andreas also noticed. As our group left the castle, Ivy praised Christopher for keeping an eye on things and mentioned that she had noticed the Baron seemed very calm and composed despite his nephew being missing. While inspecting her sword, she asked Andreas if the Baron's calm demeanor was the reason he insisted they leave today. Andreas confirmed her assumption and explained that there were other things that caught his attention and seemed extremely strange. He pointed out that the part about the missing investigators, with whom they had lost contact, sounded like a fabricated story. Additionally, it was odd that they had only sent one investigator despite several months having passed. But what was most peculiar was the butler's insistence that they would only arrive in the village after nightfall and his strong insistence that they stay overnight. When Ivy told him that she appreciated his concern but the mission came first and declined his offer, he wore a very dissatisfied expression. Andreas realized that after they rejected his offer, he seemed as if his plan had failed. He explained to Ivy that he found all their movements, glances, or even their breathing to be as if they were hiding something. That's why our group wanted to head to the village immediately and boarded a carriage. 2 horses pulled the carriage at an insane speed. It was nighttime now, and the horses rode on a narrow path through a forest. In the carriage, Christopher asked if they should look for a place to stay once they arrived. However, Ivy made it clear that investigating the town was their priority. Andreas also pondered and wanted to start examining the landlord's castle right away. Everything up until now seemed suspicious to him, and he wanted to begin investigating the house of the missing person. Suddenly, he noticed something and instinctively placed his hand on his chest. His mana had suddenly started to move. The closer they got to the village, the more it spiraled out of control. He wondered what was happening all of a sudden. The whole group suddenly realized that something was wrong, and the carriage was speeding up. Hazar asked the carriage driver what was going on. However, Christopher reacted quicker and told him to move. He opened the window and looked outside to see what was happening and why they were suddenly accelerating. But when he saw what was happening, he couldn't believe his eyes. The coachman, acting like a madman, whipped the horses uncontrollably, causing them to run as fast as possible in a frenzy. The carriage kept accelerating. Christopher informed his comrades that something was wrong with the coachman. Ivy tried to analyze the situation and then kicked open the carriage door, which fell to the ground outside. She looked outside but realized it was too late, and they were about to collide with something any moment now. She told her group to prepare for impact immediately. She explained that they were about to crash into the village gate and everyone tried to brace themselves as best as they could for the impact. They crashed through the village gate at insane speed, and the carriage flipped over and slid further into the town where people seemed to still be on the streets. The coachman slid along the ground and came to a stop amidst dancing bare feet. Everywhere, the people were dancing, completely oblivious to the group that had just crashed through their village gate. Hypnotized and possessed, all the residents danced under the blue moons. Our group had survived the impact relatively well and was in the process of climbing out of the carriage. They looked at the dancing individuals with confusion. Christopher asked Andreas what was going on. As a mage, he should know what had happened to the town's residents. Andreas realized that this had to be a bigger issue than just a mana anomaly. He knew that the fact his mana was reacting to the mana in the environment was due to the presence of dark magic. Suddenly, one of the dancing children ran towards the group in a frenzy, but Vivian immediately pinned them down. Our group was curious and wanted to examine it more closely. Vivian realized that the power emanating from the child was not that of a normal child, as she had to exert quite a bit of effort to keep the child pinned down. Hazar examined the child's feet, which were completely bloody from all the dancing. They concluded that it must be a curse. Hazar posed the question of whether there could be a connection between their mission and the curse. Christopher mentioned that the landlord had been missing for over a month, and if he had been dancing all that time, he would have died from exhaustion. Andreas also realized that there must be someone taking care of the villagers to prevent them from dying. Christopher had a slightly different thought but didn't want to start an argument. Ivy realized that they might have been drawn into something very dangerous and problematic. Andreas knew that he wouldn't die here within the framework of the game. Furthermore, he considered that if they had followed the butler's suggestion, the Baron might have covered everything up. But since they had rushed straight to the village, the situation had changed. And they were thrust into a dangerous situation. The mana that Andreas felt was at the same level as that of his master, Sharon. However, what surprised him was the radius, which was much larger than expected. Suddenly, an idea struck Andreas as to why the user might have such a large radius, and he considered the possibility of it being an artifact that enhanced their magic. Christopher noticed that Andreas was lost in thought and asked him what he was thinking about. Andreas said that they had too many clues to follow, and it would be best to start investigating the landlord's house for information. He believed that in such a situation, information was crucial. The group made their way to the landlord's house and found a few burning corpses outside. Ivy kicked the door in with a powerful kick. They stormed into the house, preparing for an attack. Immediately, they looked around and saw many bodies lying on the floor in the entrance hall. Men and women lay dead on the ground. Christopher noticed something and realized that the clothing of some of the individuals matched that of the investigation team. He also noticed that they must have been dead for a while. Andreas told the others that they might not be able to handle this on their own. Ivy wanted to know exactly what he meant by that. Andreas explained to the others that based on everything he had seen, he believed this to be the work of a black mage. Ivy wanted to know more specifically how he came to that conclusion. He explained to Ivy and the others that he believed a black mage would influence and amplify people's emotions to draw magic from them. Ivy added that the main power of black magic was derived from emotions. Therefore, she also realized that the landlord was probably already dead. Andreas agreed, saying that it was very likely since he must have hindered the black mage's plans. Christopher then asked if the burning bodies outside the mansion were part of a black magic ritual. Andreas replied that this could be a possibility. Ivy said that they would know the truth once they apprehended the culprits. She didn't want to give up for now and suggested searching the entire estate. Andreas and the others started turning the whole building upside down. They took candle holders and went through the corridors, searching every corner of the house. However, in the end, they found nothing, not even the landlord's body. Meanwhile, Vivian looked out the window and told Hazar that he should take a look as well. He turned around to see what she meant. Andreas also looked outside and noticed that all the villagers were making their way towards the building. He looked very dismayed but realized that the perpetrator was finally making a move. The group wondered what they should do next, as the first zombies were already looking up and had noticed them. Andreas also noticed this. Hazar asked Ivy what they should do now and wanted to hear her opinion as the supervisor. She said that they should abandon the investigation of the building and escape. She also assigned Hazar the task of finding an escape route that would get them out of the building unharmed. Hazar rushed off immediately and got to work. He ran quickly to the end of the corridor but then realized that something was wrong. The zombies were already storming the building, running up the stairs to the second floor, and overpowering Hazar. He was even touched by a few zombies. Christopher rushed forward to help his new friend and pushed aside the attacking zombies in the front row. He drew his sword and ordered the others to protect Andreas since he was the mage of the group. He turned around and said that he would take care of the front line. At which point the zombies swelled slightly. As it brightened in front of him, and he reflexively turned back around, the zombies exploded, killing him. Andreas got some blood splattered on his face in the process. Christopher flew across the corridor and landed on the floor due to the explosion. Suddenly, Andreas was completely shocked and unable to move. When he saw Christopher dead on the ground, he recognized him as one of his former soldier friends. He fell to the ground and gasped for air. While Hazar picked up Christopher, Ivy tried to make Andreas understand that more zombies were coming and they needed to leave now, or it would be too late. However, Andreas couldn't react and had become unconscious. So Ivy also lifted him onto her shoulders and ordered Vivian to destroy the window. Without hesitation, Vivian kicked in the window, and Ivy and the others jumped out, landing with a powerful impact on the ground. Carrying Andreas and Christopher on their shoulders, they quickly ran away. While running, Andreas regained consciousness and realized that he was having flashbacks of his last mission. He raised his hand and gathered magic in it. Then he cast the spell, Grease, on the ground, causing the zombies to fall. He followed it up with his second spell, Earth Shield, to further hinder them. Ivy, however, didn't like this and asked him if he thought he had to fight alone. She continued to tell him not to exhaust all his mana and asked if he could locate the black mage by tracing his magic. As they ran and looked for a hiding spot, he told her that he could do that. Andreas knew that the mage wasn't exactly hiding his magic, making it easy to track him down. He closed his eyes and cast the spell, Mana Detect, allowing him to see through the zombies, through the town, until he found a small building within the city where he ultimately located him and opened his eyes. He told Ivy that the black mage was in a house that was at 9 o'clock from their position and about 100 meters away. She praised him and immediately changed direction, making her way towards the building where the black mage was. She was so fast that the others couldn't keep up. Unfortunately, she was moving so quickly that she didn't even notice the request to slow down. Running at maximum speed, she reached the building Andreas had described. However, the black mage was already waiting and had anticipated their arrival. Despite the tension and calmness, the mage remained undisturbed. When Andreas and Ivy arrived at the house, Ivy wasted no time and promptly kicked the door open. Andreas couldn't help but wonder if they had to kick down every door they encountered. Ivy realized they were likely correct and that the black mage might be hiding somewhere inside. She cautiously entered the room. As Andreas attempted to enter the room shortly after her, he noticed a red magical barrier between him and Ivy. Both of them realized it was a trap and that the black mage had outsmarted them. Ivy focused solely on the barrier in front of her and failed to realize she wasn't alone in the building. Suddenly, she heard a voice and turned around. A zombie girl, almost completely wrapped in bandages and bleeding, said she was in great pain and then screamed, shocking and paralyzing Ivy. Andreas tried to open the barrier but realized it was beyond his power. Suddenly, he heard a voice that told him how pathetic he was and repeated insulting words. He looked up and noticed that the barrier extended throughout the entire city and formed a second barrier outside it. Andreas couldn't believe what he was seeing and stared incredulously at the spectacle above, unable to take his eyes off it. He heard a voice telling him that everything was happening by God's command and that he should bow before the name, Sloth. Andreas recognized the name Sloth and couldn't believe he would hear that name here and now. The game he was in was called Great Sin, or Peccata, in Latin. The story began when Sloth separated the 7 deadly sins from the main body, the Codex of the Apocalypse. If one could collect them all, they could summon the final boss. These items were crucial in the game to advance the story. As Andreas thought about these things, the zombies around him attacked him. But before they could grab him, he managed to dodge them with a powerful leap. During his evasion maneuver, he wondered why he would hear the name Sloth on the outskirts of the land, in a place that didn't even appear in the main quest. He fought off more attacking zombies and realized that he would never last long enough alone to make it out of here alive. Managing to get past the zombies, he ran to his other teammates. The others were also fighting against the zombies, who attacked them without regard for their own lives. Vivian was in a complete rage mode, attacking any zombie she saw, even with just a glimpse. She knew only one thing in that moment, driven by pure bloodlust. Hazar stood beside Christopher's lifeless body, allowing her to kill the zombies as she pleased. Andreas then encountered the group and asked Hazar what had happened to Vivian. Hazar was surprised to see Andreas and relieved that he was safe. He explained that he hadn't seen them until now. Andreas knew he couldn't trust Hazar, but he didn't want to leave Christopher alone, so he decided to play along for now. He told Hazar that Ivy was trapped in a barrier. Hazar asked what they should do next. Once again, Andreas heard the voice of the black mage, telling them that they were pathetic and that they were currently killing innocent villagers. Hazar also heard the voice and turned around frantically. Andreas explained to him that it was most likely the voice of the Black Mage. He also told him that the mage might be near Ivy. Hazar, concerned for Ivy's safety, wanted to go to her aid and left Christopher and Vivian with Andreas. Andreas thought that Hazar was far too obvious in trying to unload his useless teammates on him but decided it was better than being betrayed by him. He instinctively looked at Vivian, who was still in a complete rage mode, destroying half the town. Andreas knew this wasn't good and that the Black Mage would further intensify her anger and draw additional energy from it. He also knew that he would meet the same fate as his comrades if he made a wrong move. Suddenly, 3 zombies rushed toward Vivian. Andreas thought it would be impossible for her to dodge this attack. However, Vivian counterattacked, astonishing Andreas with what he saw. Not only did she manage to dodge, but she also struck back directly. Suddenly, he heard a voice. He looked next to him on the rooftop and recognized the Black Mage sitting there. The mage asked Andreas what would happen now that the only one who wasn't injured or captured had escaped. Andreas replied that it didn't matter since he hadn't expected anything from Hazar anyway. The Black Mage remarked that Andreas was unusually calm. Andreas said he had already anticipated his presence, as it was now time for the main boss to appear. The mage stood up and said he didn't know where Andreas got his confidence from but wanted to test him due to his courage. Andreas then disappeared into a dark aura. He quickly realized that he had made a mistake and had been careless for a moment. He found himself in a kind of galactic cosmos. Andreas widened his eyes and then dissolved. He wondered what was happening all of a sudden. When he opened his eyes again, he saw his hands wearing military gloves. He found himself back in his original body and wondered if he was dreaming. Suddenly, something exploded behind him, and he realized he was on the battlefield. He immediately prepared himself, took the gun in his hand, and wondered where everyone else was. He ran and held his head in confusion. Suddenly, he stopped and looked ahead in bewilderment. He saw a burning person on the other side of the battlefield. The burning person called Andreas' real name, Makoto, and told him to run. Andreas recognized that it was Shohei, one of his former comrades. Without hesitation, he ran across the battlefield toward him. But Shohei was already dead and fell into his arms. Andreas couldn't believe it and called out Shohei's name. Suddenly, Shohei disappeared, and another person with green hair emerged from his body. Andreas leaned over the person and wondered who the new person was. Together with his other self as Andreas, he realized that the person Shohei had transformed into was Andreas' father. He remembered how his father had given him the ring and told him that as long as he had the ring, he would be the true lord of the Cromwell household. With his last breaths, Andreas' father expressed that he no longer wanted to be a burden to him and asked him to be happy with his sister Amy. Tears streamed down Andreas' face as he realized what he had meant to his father back then. Andreas reached out his hand. Suddenly, the Black Mage noticed something and was astonished to see the black illusion barrier that had trapped Andreas shatter. Andreas shattered the barrier, causing it to completely implode. As the barrier broke, Andreas stood there unharmed. The Black Mage asked him how he could escape Sloth's curse and break the barrier surrounding him. Andreas didn't answer the question and simply stood there. A system window appeared before him. The system window informed Andreas that the synchronization rate between Makoto and him had now reached 100%. Furthermore, it informed him that as a result, he had gained Makoto's talent, Combat Exceptional. Andreas explained that Sloth's curse was nothing more than a game that simulated a person's daydreams. He also said that the wizard who had cursed him didn't truly possess the ability to harness his full potential. The Black Mage could hardly believe what he was hearing and grew angry. He immediately prepared a new spell and launched a kind of black spear at Andreas. Andreas managed to dodge it and asked the mage what he planned to do now that he knew the curse wouldn't affect him. This only made the mage angrier. Filled with rage, he cast another spear and attacked Andreas again, telling him to shut up. But once again, Andreas evaded and leaped to the side. He realized that the mage wasn't strong but couldn't end it without his necromancy. He halted his evasive maneuver and looked left and right. He surveyed his surroundings and saw that no one was watching him. Then he looked back at the mage, who jumped down from the roof. The mage asked Andreas who he was. Andreas told him that he would show him and began to use his necromancy ability. When the mage saw Andreas utilizing his ability, he was greatly surprised. The system informed Andreas that 23 corpses had been found. But due to his low level, he was only capable of summoning 9. A turquoise mist rose from the corpses, and skeletons emerged from it. The black mage was shocked to discover that Andreas was a necromancer and wondered if he belonged to the Black Mage Assembly and if they knew about Sloth and the artifact. Andreas deduced from the mage's reaction that there was indeed a Black Mage Assembly and that he mistakenly believed Andreas to be a member of that assembly. He wanted to take advantage of this misunderstanding. The system window informed him that he had summoned 7 regular skeletons and 2 skeleton warriors. Andreas told the mage that he had been tasked by the assembly to retrieve Sloth's pages. The black mage was puzzled that someone so weak, with only a few skeletons, had been assigned such a task. He cast a few black energy spheres. However, the skeletons wasted no time and immediately attacked the mage. He hurled the magical black energy spheres at the advancing skeletons and asked Andreas if he really believed he could oppose the power of Sloth with just those few skeletons. The spheres completely destroyed the skeletons and continued flying toward Andreas. He managed to summon an earth shield at the last moment and blocked the attack. The mage told Andreas to stop pretending and cast his dark spear once again. Andreas reached his hand backward and summoned his companion. Nickel. The mage hurled his spear towards Andreas, claiming that these skeletons were nothing more than a few small flies. However, Nickel had already entered through the portal and prepared to assist his master. He rushed forward and sliced through the spear flying towards Andreas. This astonished the mage, who couldn't believe that Nickel had simply cut through his attack. He was completely bewildered and somewhat fearful. The mage then conjured a small cube in his hand, which surprised him. A large hand attacked Nickel, but they managed to block the attack with some effort. The black mage's cube split into many small pages, and Andreas recognized them as the pages of Sloth. The mage couldn't believe that Andreas had pushed him to the point of having to utilize his valuable collected Sloth energy. He wanted Andreas to pay for disrupting his plans with his life. The conjured hands of the mage grew larger, and Nickel and Andreas had to maneuver to dodge the attacks. Andreas knew that he could keep up with this speed and that Nickel could withstand the attacks. The assaults continued to rain down on them. The mage screamed for them to finally die. Andreas realized that the attacks were getting faster, and he also recognized that the mage was struggling to control his power and hadn't yet fully mastered the strength of Sloth. He decided to go for his blind spot and attack him there. He fought his way behind Nickel and shared his plan with him. Then came a powerful attack from the black mage, raising a cloud of dust. The controlled hands took a brief pause, allowing the dust to settle. When the dust cleared, the mage saw Andreas still standing and had to admit that he was quite resilient. Andreas was out of breath and said that Nickel was just a skeleton he had created, giving the impression that the mage had succeeded in destroying him. The mage couldn't believe that he had taken away his partner and weakened him in such a way. However, he assured Andreas not to worry, as he would soon follow him. He then commanded his hands controlled by Sloth's power to attack Andreas once again, and they set in motion, launching their assault. Andreas made a face as if he had been waiting for this. Suddenly, a portal opened behind the black mage, and Nickel emerged, splitting the mage into 2 halves. As the 2 halves separated, Andreas was revealed.